The most dangerous weapon in this story was never the gun. It was perception. She was supposed to be invisible. Another waitress serving powerful men who paid for silence. But Elena saw what empire does to a room. The sweat, the timing, the false calm before violence. And when she chose to intervene, she shattered more than an assassination attempt. She exposed the fragile architecture of masculine power, betrayal, and control. Because Julian believed he ruled the table, until a woman no one noticed became the only one who truly understood it.
Heels. She was offered a choice with a 3-second fuse, his life or hers. What followed wasn't an act of panicked survival, nor the selfless reflex of some cinematic hero. It was an answer articulated with a ballpoint pen on a restaurant receipt. Heels. When Elena placed the bill before Vittorio, it was more than a request for payment. It was a prophecy spelled out in 3 small circles drawn around 3 banal words on the itemized summary. Gunman. Wrong. Exit. Heels. It lay there between them while her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Vittorio, for his part, remained a statue. No twitch of the eye, no hitch in his breathing. Only the slow, deliberate drift of his hand toward his waist. Heels. This is the story of how a waitress, armed with nothing but a lifetime spent reading the storm clouds in men, deconstructed an execution, saved a king, and was conscripted into his war. Heels. The rain in Seattle never truly cleanses. It just moves the city's filth from one place to another. But inside the Velvet Heart Steakhouse, the downpour was merely ambiance. Heels. A gentle percussion on the thick plate glass that separated the city's predators from their prey. Elena smoothed her apron, a uniform that felt more like a harness with each passing minute. 11:45 p.m. Heels. The ache in her feet had long since dissolved into a low-grade hum she'd learned to ignore. For 3 years she'd served here, long enough to understand that the men at these tables weren't just buying overpriced steak. They were purchasing silence. Heels. They were leasing the deep shadows that pooled in the room's corners. They were renting the complicity of people like her, ghosts paid to materialize with wine and then vanish. Heels. But Elena was never truly good at vanishing. She was, however, exceptional at pretending to, which is an entirely different art form. Heels. A childhood with a father who gambled on everything taught her how to scan a room for its hidden dangers before she even crossed the threshold. She became fluent in the subtle tells of deceit. The slight shift in posture before a strike. Heels. The distinct metallic scent of fear. And tonight, table 4 reeked of ozone and leather that cost more than a man's life. Vittorio Thorne was seated with his back to the wall, the practiced posture of a man who lives in the company of ghosts. Heels. He was a man of sharp lines and deep-set shadows, his suit worth more than the sum of Elena's entire life. To the world, he was a logistics tycoon. To the city's dark corners, he was the Thorne Syndicate. Heels. He possessed the kind of severe beauty that steals the air from your lungs, a face that looked carved from granite, eyes the color of aged whiskey, and a powerful stillness that was far more unsettling than any overt aggression. Seated opposite him, Heels. A younger, unfamiliar man was a walking collection of nervous tics. He adjusted his tie. He glanced toward the kitchen again. Elena moved between the tables with the water pitcher, the plush carpet muting her steps. As she neared table 4, Heels, she lowered her gaze in a gesture of practiced servitude, but her awareness was a razor's edge, absorbing everything. The sound of a throat clearing. "The channels are secure, Vittorio," the young man said, his voice catching on the name. Heels. "We just need the signature for the transfer." Vittorio's reply was silence. He simply sliced his steak, the knife moving with surgical precision. Heels. "You're perspiring, Marcus. The room is 68 degrees. It was a statement, not a question. It's the pressure. The Russians are insistent." Elena started to pour. In the curved, distorted reflection on the water streaming into the glass, Heels, she saw the dark window behind Marcus's head. Outside, a street lamp sputtered to life over an illegally parked black van. But it wasn't the van that turned her blood to ice. It was the reflection of the hallway behind her, Heels, the one out of Vittorio's line of sight. The kitchen door was propped ajar. A man was waiting in the shadows, not a chef. He wore a dark jacket, and he was twisting a suppressor onto the barrel of a pistol. Heels. Elena's hand didn't so much as tremble. To spill the water was to sign her own death warrant. To scream was the same. The figure in the kitchen was waiting for a signal. Marcus, a mess of frayed nerves, checked his watch. 3 seconds. Heels. He cast a furtive look at the kitchen entrance. 2. Elena glided back to the service station, her mind racing so fast the world seemed to slow to a crawl around her. She printed the check for table 4, a single slip of paper, 1 ribeye, 1 Pinot Noir, deals, 1 sparkling water, 1 side of truffle fries, a perfectly mundane receipt for a profoundly violent end. She grabbed her pen, its tip hovering over the paper. A written note was too clumsy. Marcus would spot it. It had to be a whisper on the page, deals. Something only a mind like Vittorio's, a mind conditioned to find the flaw in any system, would ever perceive. Deals. The fine print, buried at the bottom of the bill, the usual corporate boilerplate. Thank you for your patronage. Management is not responsible for lost items. If a deal is unsatisfactory, please speak to staff. If something has gone wrong, deals, notify us immediately. Please find the nearest exit in case of emergency. Gunman policy applies to all patrons. It was a jumble of legalese, but the words were there. Elena's pen came down, 3 sharp, decisive circles in blue ink. Gunman, wrong, exit, deals. She returned to the table. Marcus was now reaching into his jacket, for paperwork, or for his own weapon. Your check, Mr. Thorne, Elena stated, her voice a flat, steady line. Deals. She placed the leather folio before Vittorio, leaving it open so the pen lay across the circled words. She did not meet his eyes. Her own were fixed on Marcus. Can I get you anything else, sir? You look a little flushed. The misdirection landed. Deals. Marcus glanced up, annoyed. No leave. In that one beat of time, Vittorio's gaze dropped to the paper. Elena watched his face. No shock, no sudden alarm. Just a deep, terrifying focus. He saw the words. In less than a second, deals. He must have mentally mapped the entire room. He didn't scan for the danger. He looked at Elena, and for a fleeting moment the mask of cold authority was gone. In its place, confusion, then a flash of ice-cold analysis. Deals. Followed by a decision that sent a chill down her spine. He made a move for his wallet, but his hand slid past it, dipping low toward his hip. Deals. Marcus, Vittorio said, his voice dropping to a low growl. You didn't sign. What? Marcus glanced down. Vittorio kicked the table, the heavy slab of oak it as if it were cardboard. In one seamless, impossible motion, deals. Vittorio launched himself sideways, not away from the threat, but toward Elena. Thwip. Thwip 2 rounds from the silenced pistol chewed through the booth's leather, exactly where his heart had been a moment before. The sound was all wrong, a soft, deals. Sickening cough, but the result was absolute. Splinters filled the air. An iron grip locked around Elena's wrist. Deals. He tore her from her feet, pulling her down into the cover of the overturned table, as a third shot made the wine glass she'd just filled explode. Stay down, Vittorio commanded, a silver handgun materializing in his grip. The executive was gone. Deals. A soldier stood in his place. Marcus scrambled back from the wreckage, yelling, Take him! Now, the figure from the kitchen charged into the dining room, his weapon spitting indiscriminately in their direction. The patrons, Deals, frozen for an instant in disbelief, finally began to scream. The restaurant's quiet sophistication was shredded by a wave of raw animal panic. Vittorio rose from cover, fired twice, and dropped back down. Deals. The first bullet sent Marcus spinning with a shattered shoulder. The second drove the gunman stumbling back toward the kitchen. Deals. The rear exit, Vittorio ordered, his eyes locked on hers, pupils wide with adrenaline. Is it clear? Yes, Elena choked out, her ears screaming. Pantry leads to the delivery alley. Go. Now, I can't just— You're in this now, Elena. Deals. He must have read her name tag. They saw you. They saw you give me the warning. Stay here and they'll kill you to erase the loose end. Move. The reality of his words struck her like a physical blow. She had acted. She was no longer a ghost. Deals. She was part of the narrative. She scrambled across the floor, broken glass biting into her palms. Vittorio moved with her, his body a living shield as he fired one last shot toward the kitchen to cover their retreat. Deals. They slammed through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The staff stood paralyzed, caught in a collective silent scream. Out! Everybody out! Vittorio roared. They sprinted past the searing heat of the stoves, the air thick and heavy. Deals. Elena threw her weight against the heavy steel door of the loading bay, shoving it open. The cold night air was a shock to the system. The rain was coming down in sheets. My car! Vittorio shouted, gesturing to a dark, sleek sedan idling in the alley. Deals. Get in. I'm not getting into a car with a gangster, Elena yelled back, stumbling away from him. The adrenaline was making her reckless. I was trying to stop a murder, not sign up for one. Vittorio seized her arm. Deals. The grip was not meant to injure, but it was unyielding, a clear promise that there was no escape. He scanned the dark opening of the alley. A squeal of tires sliced through the noise of the storm. The van from across the street was bearing down on them. Heels. You see those headlights? Vittorio hissed, the rain matting his black hair to his forehead. That's the second team, the cleaners. You saved my life. If you stay here, they will peel the skin from your bones to learn what you know. Get in the car. Heels. A submachine gun opened up from the mouth of the alley. A line of bullets sparked off the brickwork, just inches from Elena's head. Her choice ceased to exist. She launched herself into the passenger seat. Vittorio vaulted over the car's hood. Heels. Landed in the driver's side and the engine screamed. Heels. The engine's eruption is not just noise, it is a visceral declaration of war. In this moment, Julian embodies the paradox of controlled chaos, one hand taming the wheel in a violent negotiation with physics, Heels, the other conducting a symphony of automatic fire. The collision with the dumpster is a dissonant chord. The sickening shriek steel on steel as the sedan is launched from the alley is the climax. They become a projectile, Heels, a brutal smear of motion against the city grid. Inside, Elena is a study in human fragility, her white-knuckled grip on the dashboard a desperate anchor in a world that has lost its axis. They hemorrhage into the arteries of Seattle traffic, Heels, a ghost vessel for whom red lights are mere suggestions. Julian's gaze, however, is tethered to the past, to the mirror. Are they following? Elena's voice is the vibration of pure fear. One car. SUV. Armored, Julian replies, his tone a flatline. Heels, a testament to a man pathologically at peace with violence. Heels. The man, Julian, operates on a kind of muscle memory bred for catastrophe. His hand finds the burner phone in the console not as a tool but as a prosthetic limb. The voice that crackles through the speaker delivers a eulogy in shorthand. Heels. Code black at the velvet heart. It is the language of collapse, a phrase that signifies not just failure but betrayal. Marcus. The name hangs in the air. Julian's self-diagnosis is delivered with the detachment of a surgeon. Compromised. Heels. A state of being that demands erasure, a retreat to a place built for ghosts. He is not alone. A civilian is with him. A brief flicker of convention. Then the correction, chilling in its precision. The asset. Heels. Elena's recoil from the term is the predictable, painful spark of humanity confronting its own objectification. The call is severed, and Julian wrenches the wheel, intent on severing their pursuers with the same finality. Heels. As the accelerator eases, they glide into the skeletal remains of an industrial park. The dashboards glow, painting Julian's face in shades of silver and shadow. You're not a person right now, Elena. The statement is an act of psychological warfare, Heels, intended to strip her of identity, yet it is delivered with a subtle cadence that hints at something other than cruelty, a strategic necessity. You're the only thing that saw a betrayal that's about to light a match to this whole city, Heels. And until it's over, his eyes find hers in the gloom. You're mine. It is not a proposition, it is a statement of absolute ownership. Elena's mind runs the cold calculus of survival, recognizing that flight is an illusion, Heels. She is contaminated by knowledge. Her question, where are we going, is not a question at all. It is the sound of capitulation, Heels. Nowhere you know, he responds. The archetypal promise of a descent into the underworld. Someplace the devil himself can't find us. The mechanical thud of the central lock serves as punctuation, the sound of a cage door closing. For 2 hours, Heels, the city is unwritten behind them. The logical grid of Seattle dissolves into the crunch of gravel as they ascend into the mountains, into a realm governed by older, darker rules. A thick, suffocating fog descends, Heels, a perfect externalization of Elena's own internal chaos. Julian remains a sculpture of vigilance, his focus absolute, his hand a permanent fixture near his weapon. Elena, meanwhile, presses herself against the door, Heels, feeling the toxic adrenaline recede, leaving behind an unnerving, hollow quiet. Heels. The trees slide past the window, ancient monoliths standing as silent witnesses to their flight. Each mile is a severance, another layer of her known world peeled away. We're here, Julian announces, Heels, his voice breaking the trance as he veers onto an access road that seems to be devoured by the night. An unseen signal from the vehicle prompts a steel barricade to retract. Its silent, humming efficiency speaking of high-end paranoia, Heels. This is no cabin. It is a monument to brutalism, a jagged piece of concrete and glass that juts from the cliffside like an act of defiance. It appears cold, impregnable, and profoundly isolated. Julian pilots the car into the earth itself, Heels, descending into a subterranean garage, Heels. When the engine cuts out, the ensuing silence is a physical pressure. He commands. Elena's limbs obey, clumsy with the residue of stress. She emerges into the sterile hum of fluorescent lighting, and for the first time, Heels, Julian's gaze seems to truly register her, not as a person but as a piece of evidence to be catalogued. His own suit is a casualty of the evening's violent transactions. Phone, he says, extending a hand. Her confusion is a brief, fragile thing. Feels. Give me your phone, Elena. Now, he dissects her unspoken protest with a single unassailable truth. You need to stay alive. In his world, a modern phone is not a tool of connection. It is a digital leash. Feels. He explains how Marcus's network is already hunting her signal, using the device in her pocket to draw a targeting reticle over her heart. She relinquishes it, a shiver of reluctance passing through her. Julian acts without hesitation. A single, yells, violent stomp of his heel, and the phone's destruction is a sharp, definitive crack. Her protest is a gasp of mundane absurdity in this theater of death. I haven't paid that off yet, yells. His retort is layered with the casual omnipotence of a man who deals in far greater currencies. I'll buy you a factory, he says, if we live through the week. Upstairs. Move, yells. They ascend in an elevator into a living space so vast and austere it feels more like a mausoleum for the living. Yells. A great wall of glass presents a panorama of pure, bottomless black. The room itself is a shrine to minimalism, stripped of warmth, of life, of history. It is not a home, it is a holding cell with a breathtaking view of the abyss. Yells. Julian moves directly to a bottle, pouring a measure of amber liquid he consumes in one raw, functional motion. In that instant, a transformation occurs. The soldier recedes, and the interrogator emerges. Feels. He gestures to a lone chair positioned in the center of the vast space, a veritable throne of vulnerability. Elena sits. He assumes a position against a desk, the posture of a predator at ease in his territory. Feels. Who is your handler? The question is a scalpel, probing for a conspiracy he is certain must exist. Elena's confusion is authentic, disarming. The person who told you to circle those words, he clarifies. Feels. His tone steeped in the cold logic of a world where nothing is accidental. He cannot process her action as spontaneous. No one, she insists, her voice trembling with a fear that feels far more genuine than any deception. He lets out a dead, feels, humorless laugh. A waitress, he posits, does not simply improvise a covert warning system in 10 seconds. He gives it a name, tradecraft. Is she government, he presses, or a rival organization? Her response is the bitter edge of sarcasm. Feels, the only weapon she has left. Feels. She rises, a sudden kinetic shift from quarry to something far more complex. She offers her life story as her credentials. Her hyper-awareness is not a learned skill. It is scar tissue, feels, formed by a childhood spent under the capricious rule of a gambler and a liar. I learned to read the twitches in a man's face before I learned to read a book, she says, each word a testament to a life spent navigating emotional minefields. Feels. She deconstructs the scene at the restaurant. Marcus's tells, the kitchen worker's incongruous footwear. I saw the gun, she concludes, her voice acquiring a hard, definite edge, because I'm always looking for one. Feels. Her entire life has been an exercise in waiting for the other shoe to drop. Feels. Julian simply observes, his silence a heavy, analytical field. He is scanning her for the tells he understands, the frantic pulse in her throat, the clench of her fists. Searching for the lie, his training screams must be there. He finds nothing. Feels. The programmed hostility in his eyes dissolves, replaced by a kind of clinical astonishment. You have a sharp eye, he concedes, the admission tasting like a recalibration of his entire worldview. Sharper than my head of security, feels. Elena's reply is blunt, a cruel piece of analysis. Your head of security is probably dead, or he was in on it. A flicker of pain crosses Julian's face, a barely perceptible wince that confirms her hypothesis was a direct hit. Feels. He acknowledges her accuracy and turns away, the awful calculus of a wider betrayal settling upon him. Feels. Marcus the accountant, he mutters, analyzing the profile. He would lack the nerve for this kind of play on his own. He required a sponsor. Elena presses the advantage, her voice quiet but firm. Moretti? Julian gives the ghost a name. Dante Moretti. Feels. A rival kingpin from New York with ambitions to consume the West Coast. Julian's death was meant to be the main course. He turns back to Elena, and for a moment the exhaustion in his features seems to carve years into his face. Feels. You just stumbled into the middle of a war. He exhales. And you're the only person in this room I know for a fact isn't trying to kill me. He picks up the receipt, now a sacred text stained with blood. Feels. He smooths the crumpled artifact onto the desk. Gunman, behind you. Deal gone wrong. Exit now. He looks at her, his eyes deconstructing the moment through his tactical filter. You could have run. You could have hidden. But she did not. Feels. You chose a side. Elena shakes her head, rejecting his binary, strategic interpretation. I just chose not to let someone get shot. Such simple morality is a foreign language in Julian's world. In my world, Elena, he says, his voice softening, feels. That is choosing a side. And then his body's own betrayal can no longer be contained. A grimace of pure agony contorts his features. He braces himself against the desk as the color drains from his face. Elena's sharp eye misses nothing. You're hurt, feels. A dark, blossoming stain is spreading across his jacket just beneath the shoulder. He attempts to dismiss it, a futile lie against the evidence of his own blood. It's a graze. I'll deal with it. In that moment, Elena undergoes her own transformation, feels. The asset, the captive, dissolves, replaced by a figure of startling authority. Sit down, take off the jacket. Her use of his name, sit down, Julian, is an insurrection, a shocking dismantling of the power structure he has so carefully constructed, feels. And it is effective. He sinks into a chair. When she asks for a medical kit, he just nods toward a bathroom, confirming it's a trauma kit. This fortress was built with the expectation of grievous injury, feels. The kit is a battlefield surgeon's arsenal. Tourniquets, hemostatic agents, suture needles. She returns and repeats the command. As Julian peels away his jacket, the white shirt beneath is revealed to be a ruin of crimson, feels. Elena takes shears to the fabric, cutting it away to expose the wound, not a graze. It is a vicious trench carved through muscle, deep and weeping. It needs stitches, she states, her face pale but her hands betraying no tremor. Do it, feels. He orders through a clenched jaw. He takes the whiskey bottle and pours the alcohol directly into the raw wound. His body convulses, a silent, electric scream passing through him, but not a single sound escapes his lips, feels. A needle, Elena uttered, her voice a fraying thread of sound, her hands trembling into a violent blur. Through the fog of her terror, Julian's words acted as a psychological anchor, a low command to find her equilibrium, feels. His voice was a study in tension, stretched taut over a core of absolute control. He clasped her wrist. His one functional hand was a sudden fever-hot brand on her skin, feels, compelling her focus away from the surrounding chaos to a single point of human contact. Look at me, she obeyed. His gaze captured hers, forging a desperate intimacy designed to pull her back from the precipice. You saved me, he stated, feels, the specter of the restaurant hanging between them, a memory invoked to reconstruct her shattered nerve. Do it again. Elena's breathing faltered, then found its rhythm. A fundamental shift occurred behind her eyes. The waitress was gone, feels, replaced by the woman wielding the needle. The steel bit into his flesh, feels. The only sounds left were the storm's fury outside, and the sharp, ragged inhalations Julian could not suppress with each stitch, feels. Elena operated with a terrible crystalline focus she hadn't known she could access. 5 stitches, each knot pulled taut, formed a perfect dark seam against his skin. She sterilized the wound, then bandaged it. Done, she exhaled, feels. The needle and blood-soaked thread slipped from her numb fingers, their clatter on a metal tray sounding like a gavel falling. Only then did the composure break, and she collapsed to the floor as if her own animating strings had been severed, feels. Julian tested the dressing with a slight movement of his arm, his face a mask of stoicism. He gave a solitary, approving nod. Good. Better than some medics I've known. The praise was a bridge built across the wreckage between them, feels. He slid a bottle of whiskey in her direction. Drink. She recoiled viscerally. I don't drink. He did not repeat the offer as a question. Tonight you do, she complied. The liquor was a fire searing her throat. Feels, a brutal medicine that finally stilled the tremors in her hands. Feels. Julian stood, retrieving a clean shirt from a bag. He left it unbuttoned, the stark white of the bandage a brutalist emblem against his skin. His fingers moved across a concealed keypad, and a wall of monitors awakened, flooding the room in a cold, feels. Electronic blue, security feeds, street cameras documenting the scene at the Velvet Heart. Satellite trackers drew cold geometric lines across a global map. What are you doing? Elena asked, her voice thin as she rose and drifted toward the light. Feels. Tallying the cost, Julian answered. Scanners are screaming. 3 bodies at the restaurant. They're classifying it as a gang hit. 3? The word was a knot in her throat. Marcus is dead, Julian said, his voice now devoid of all effect. My shot. Feels. The shooter from the kitchen is dead too. Feels. My shot, he reiterated, the words echoing like phantoms in the sterile air. And a bystander, caught in the crossfire. Elena squeezed her eyes shut as a wave of profound nausea washed over her. Oh God, this was not your fault, Julian declared. Feels. His tone absolute, constructing a verbal fortress around her encroaching guilt. Look. He indicated a grainy image, a traffic camera aimed at a darkened street, a black van, and positioned behind it, a sleek silver sedan stood like a sentinel. That car, Beals, Julian stated as the image magnified. That is not a common model. Note the rims, custom. So, that car belongs to one man, Elias Thorne. Elena scoured her memory but found nothing. A relative? My father's brother, Beals. Julian clarified, and the ambient temperature of the room seemed to plummet. My uncle, the one who supposedly retired to a Tuscan villa 5 years ago. Beals. Why would your uncle try to kill you? Because, Julian said, his eyes scanning the screens with a terrifying predatory intensity. He never wanted to retire. Beals. When my father died, the organization passed to me, not to him. Julian spoke of it not as a business, but as a stolen birthright. The old guard considered Elias a relic, too impulsive. He wanted to expand into narcotics. I transitioned us into logistics. Beals. Technology smuggling. It was cleaner, with far deeper pockets. He was framing his coup as a necessary evolution. He never forgave me for it. Julian's fist slammed the desk, a sudden fracture in his icy composure. This wasn't Moretti's play. Beals. This was a war from within. Elias made a deal. He serves me to Moretti on a platter. Moretti gains my shipping lanes, and Elias reclaims his throne. He turned to face her, his eyes dark with their shared predicament. This is worse than I imagined. Why? Beals. Because Elias knows this place. He helped my father build it. As if the words themselves were an incantation, a single red light on the console began to pulse. Beals. A quiet, rhythmic chime began to pervade the space. Sector 4. The perimeter has been breached. Elena felt her breath seize in her chest. They're here. They weren't looking for us, Julian corrected. Beals. His voice achieving a dangerous calm as he retrieved a heavy assault rifle from a weapons locker. The sound of him chambering around was deafening in the ensuing silence. They were coming here from the start. This was always the endgame. Beals. If the restaurant failed, they knew this was my bolt hole. A heavy Kevlar vest was tossed at her feet. Put it on. Julian, I don't know how to use a gun. You don't have to, he said, the protector persona locking firmly into place. Beals. You just have to live. He moved to the window, a dark silhouette against the storm-ravaged night. Beals. Kill the lights. Elena scrambled for the switch, plunging their sanctuary into absolute blackness, the only illumination now coming from the violent strobing flashes of the storm. How many? She whispered. Beals, huddled behind a massive desk that now felt as substantial as paper. Julian raised a handheld thermal scope to his eye. 2 trucks at the gate. 8 men. Full tactical. The device's green glow cast his face in a ghoulish light. These aren't gangsters. Beals. Elena. They are professionals. Elias buys the best. He glanced toward her, his expression unreadable in the shadows, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Listen carefully. In the basement, there's a wine cellar. Behind the racks, you'll find a tunnel. Beals. It extends for half a mile and emerges on the beach. Beals. There's an old boathouse, a small motorboat inside. We're getting out. No, Julian corrected. You're getting out. What? They will hunt the car on these roads and send us off a cliff. My only real chance is to hold them here, from a position of elevation. Beals. I can buy you 20 minutes. You want me to just leave you? Her voice was fracturing, betraying her resolve. I want you to have a life, he snapped, crouching before her, his hands gripping her shoulders with force. You are not a part of this. You have a cat, Beals, a job, a tomorrow. If you stay here, you die with me. Elias will guarantee it, and you. I was born into this, he said, the finality in his tone absolute. I will die in it. There was a protracted silence. No, Elena said. He stared at her. No, Beals. No, she repeated, her voice discovering a resilience that stunned them both. I circled the ad. I brought you here. I am not running while you remain behind to die for me. A flicker of something fragile and human broke through her newfound resolve. Beals. Besides, she swallowed, I can't drive a boat. A flash of lightning illuminated Julian's face, revealing a conflict between disbelief and a raw, potent admiration. You are the most impossible woman I have ever known, he breathed. Beals. I work in a steakhouse, Julian. I handle angry men for a living. Being impossible is a job requirement. At that precise moment, the front window imploded, and a canister skittered across the floor, vomiting a thick white smoke. Beals. Gas, Julian shouted. Masks under the desk. He produced 2 gas masks, forcing one over her face before securing his own. The room was already becoming a swirling, suffocating cloud. They're breaching, his voice came through, muffled and metallic. Beals. Stay down. Stay with me. He pressed a snub-nosed revolver into her hand. Its cold weight felt profane, an undeniable conclusion to the life she had once known. "If it's not me coming through that door," he said, "you use this." Feels. The weapon was alien in her grasp. Point. Pull the trigger, don't think. The world detonated in a cacophony of noise. Bullets tore through the heavy oak doors, sending splinters flying like shrapnel through the smoke. Julian rose from his position, Feels, answering with controlled bursts from his rifle. Feels. A scream ripped through the chaos from the hallway beyond. Elena curled herself into a smaller shape beneath the desk, the sounds composing a terrifying symphony of destruction. Through the roiling smoke, Feels, she saw it, a form detaching itself from the shadows to her left. A man clad in black, moving to flank Julian's blind side. He raised a shotgun, the barrel aimed squarely at Julian's exposed back. There was no thought, no internal debate. Feels. There existed only the raw geometry of the instant. The threat, the protector, and her. She raised the revolver, her hand shook, but she braced her wrist against the desk's solid edge. Feels. She pulled the trigger. The firearm bucked in her hand like a living creature. The shot was errant, obliterating a vase on a distant shelf, but the sound was sufficient. The mercenary flinched, his head snapping toward the new threat. "Julian!" "Left!" Feels, she screamed, the words distorted by her mask. Julian spun, dropping low and acquiring the target in one seamless motion. 2 clean shots. The man crumpled to the floor. Julian's eyes met hers through the haze of smoke and plexiglass. Feels. She felt the sheer weight of his gaze, its intensity. He gave one sharp nod acknowledgement, a salute. "Reloading," he yelled, and then a new sound penetrated the din of gunfire, a soft electronic beeping emanating from the vents above. Julian froze, Feels, his head snapping upward. "Ventilation system," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "They've overridden it." Feels. "They are not merely entering, they are an occupying force, a tide of white smoke that consumes the room." The vapor shifts, curdling into a bilious yellow. "Nerve gas?" Elena's question is a fragile thing. Feels. Her voice tight as the atmosphere finally constricts. Worse, Julian corrects, his own tone a grim counterpoint. "Anathelius doesn't want me dead yet." Against this, the masks are a useless ritual. Julian sways, Feels. The architecture of his posture failing, the rifle becoming an impossible weight before it slips from his grasp. "Elena," he forces out, the words thick with the encroaching paralysis. "The tunnel, now, go," he collapses. Feels. A puppet whose strings have been severed. Elena feels that same inertia in her own body, a leaden pull toward the tilting floor. An instinct to crawl toward him, to anchor him, is overruled by a body that will no longer obey. Then, Feels, the front doors shatter inward. Feels. Through the jaundiced fog, 4 figures emerge, encased in hazmat gear, their humanity erased, their movements methodical, serene. Feels. The world was dissolving at its periphery when he appeared, the final image to be seared into her consciousness before the blackness swept in. He was a specter in a tailored gray suit, moving with a predator's economy behind his soldiers, Feels, leaning on a cane. His eyes cold, appraising, passed over Julian's inert form before settling on her. "Well," the voice was a dry rasp, the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Dinner is served." In the next instant, Feels. The floor rose to meet her skull and the universe was extinguished. She does not wake. Consciousness is forced upon her, a violent baptism of ice water to the face. A brutal gasp rips through her, her lungs in revolt. She strains to move, Feels, to claw the water from her vision. But her hands are bound behind her, the plastic cuffs biting into her wrists like teeth. Feels. She is in a cage. A specimen is bolted to a concrete floor inside a metal chair. The air is a dense cocktail of rust and brine and old blood, the specific perfume of a place engineered for deconstruction. Feels. One can map the room's geography by its echo. The high ceilings, the corrugated steel of warehouse walls, the metronomic death rattle of some distant machinery. A damp chill clings to her, a whisper of the nearby sea, the port of Tacoma, she surmises. Feels. A voice confirms she is conscious. Her vision bleeds back into focus. First, the mercenary from the hotel, a monolith of muscle and malice. But her gaze moves beyond him. 10 feet away, Julian is suspended. Not sitting, hanging, Feels. His wrists are locked in shackles chained to a hoist, a posture calibrated to tear the tendons from his heels. Feels. The shirt she had mended is gone, revealing a torso that serves as a raw canvas for fresh torments. A dark, blossoming bruise mottles the skin over his ribs. A dressing on his shoulder weeps with new, bright blood. "Julian," she breathes. Feels. The name itself a broken thing. He compels his head to rise. Swelling has sealed his left eye, and his lip is split wide. But the single eye that remains locks onto hers, and within it, a fire burns like a warning. "Don't talk," he growls. Feels. the words heavy and fractured. Don't give them a thing. A new voice glides from the shadows. Elias Thorne steps into the light. He is Julian, but an older vintage, curdled by time. Julian is granite, formed by pressure for endurance. Elias is flint, feels all sharp edges and cruel spark, feels. He is draped in a charcoal suit, immaculate, a clean line of order drawn against the room's ambient decay. Welcome back to the land of the living, Miss. Elias pauses, letting the silence exert its own pressure, demanding her name. Alina, she supplies, feels. My name is Elena. He seems to taste the name on his tongue. Elena, a waitress, a ghost. And yet you are the single variable that kept my nephew from his grave. A loose thread. He crosses to Julian, feels, pressing the tip of his cane into the fresh gunshot wound. Julian's body goes rigid, a silent scream arching through his frame as sweat beads on his skin, yet no sound breaches his lips. Stop it, Elena shrieks, the sound tearing from a primal place. Feels. Elias turns, a phantom smile playing on his lips. He has an impressive tolerance for pain. It was beaten into him. Feels. My brother forged him into a weapon, but every weapon has a fail-safe. Or in this case, a key. Herein lies the tragedy of our little play, Elena. Since you found your way into the family business, feels, you may as well understand the stakes. Julian converted the Thorne Syndicate's entire fortune, our liquidity, our contracts, our secrets, into a digital ghost secured on a decentralized ledger. Brilliant, impenetrable. He taps the screen, feels. Too impenetrable. You see, you need two components to access the vault. His eye and a 24-character password that exists only in his mind. Without that phrase, the fortune becomes vapor. I cannot pay my soldiers, feels. I cannot buy back my throne. He stands close to Julian once more. I have his eye. That is a physical asset I can take at my leisure. But the password, that, he must surrender. Go to hell, Elias, Julian coughs, feels. A prayer of blood and spittle that soils his uncle's perfect suit. Elias sighs, a performance of theatrical disappointment, predictable. So defiant, he offers a slight nod. The mercenary advances, brandishing a pair of industrial pliers. Feels. We will begin with the fingers, Elias announces, his tone utterly clinical. The left hand, he won't require it for signing documents. No, Elena interrupts. Wait, look at him. He is already fading. If he goes into shock, that password dies with him. Feels. Elias raises one finger and the procedure halts. Feels. The mercenary freezes mid-motion. Elias studies Elena now, his curiosity ignited. She is correct. Elena insists, her mind a frantic search for leverage, for any path forward. You said it yourself. 24 characters. A blow to the head, feels. Cardiac arrest, his memory will fragment. Torture him too much and you are simply erasing the hard drive. Elias tilts his head, a predatory bird assessing its prey. You possess a remarkably detailed knowledge of trauma for a waitress, feels. I watch medical dramas. She lies, words feeling thin. It is simple logic. You need him lucid, true, Elias concedes. But pain is an excellent tool for focusing the mind, not his mind. Elena counters, gesturing toward Julian, feels. Look at his eyes. He has already retreated somewhere else. He isn't even in this room, feels. He is not here. You can disassemble him piece by piece and you will gain nothing. That is how he was constructed, is it not? Julian's gaze flickers to her, a glint of confusion in the wreckage of his face. Then he understands her strategy, feels. A desperate gambit to seize control of the narrative. So, Elias says, gliding toward Elena, his proximity a chilling weight. If physical stimuli will not break the soldier, perhaps we should try an emotional key. He gestures. Bring her, feels. The mercenary slices her free, hauls her up, and throws her to the floor in the center of the room. He forces her to kneel at Julian's feet. He draws a Sig Sauer P320. The cold metal of the muzzle finds her temple, feels a new and terrible pressure point in this symphony of agony, feels. Elias smiles, a death's head grin. The code, Julian, or the little waitress who saved you will become a crimson abstraction on a concrete floor. Julian strains against the chains, the metal groaning with an impossible tension. She means nothing, feels. She is collateral. Elias whispers, I saw the surveillance from the hotel, the way you watched her while she tended your wounds. That is your weakness. He nods. The mercenary cocks the hammer. A single, sharp click punctuates the silence. Feels. 10 seconds, Julian, Elias declares. One, don't you do it, Julian, Elena cries out, tears streaming down her face, yet her voice is an anchor. Don't give it to him. Feels. The moment he has what he wants, he kills us both. He only needs you breathing to axe ghosts. 2. Elias intones. Stop talking, Elena. Julian groans, his voice scraped raw with pain. 3. Feels. Elena's gaze locks onto the mercenary, a large man, chewing gum. His attention is a narrow beam focused on Elias, awaiting the signal to the woman beneath his weapon. Her hands are still bound, but she is no longer tethered. She can move. 4. Feels. She stabilizes her breathing, forging a small island of calm in the maelstrom. She catalogs the environment. His stance is wide, but his weight is shifted back. The floor is slick with moisture. Elias is a yard away, depending on his cane. Feels. 5. The first word is vengeance, Julian roars. Elias' smile deepens as he lowers the tablet. Good boy. And the next? No, Elena screams, and she becomes motion. She does not wait for the count of 6. Feels. She throws herself backward. Not a trained maneuver, but an act of pure, desperate physics. Her bound fists connect with the mercenary's groin with the kinetic force of a hammer. He buckles with a guttural sound. Feels. The gun's aim faltering for a critical second. As he staggers, Elena rolls, sweeping her legs into his ankles. His balance, already compromised, fails completely. His head strikes the concrete with a sickening crack. Feels. The pistol skitters away into the darkness. Feels. What? Elias spits, turning. But Elena is already a blur, scrambling for the weapon. Not to fire she cannot, but to remove it from play, kicking it deep into the shadows beneath a stack of rotting pallets. Get her, Elias barks to the other 2 guards. Feels. The cane, Julian bellows. The command strikes Elena like a surge of current. She does not think, she acts. Rolling onto her back, she kicks upward. Her foot connects with the wood of Elias's cane, sending it arcing through the air. Feels. His pillar of support gone, Elias crumples to the floor. Cut me down, Julian roars, his entire body convulsing with the effort. Elena, the guard's belt. The knife. Feels. The proximity of the guards became a suffocating pressure. 30 feet, then 20. Here Elena pivots from prey to survivor, scrambling toward the neutralized mercenary. She turns her back to the threat, a telling gesture. Feels, as her fingers blindly seek the outline of a knife sheath on his belt. The blade is drawn. Now on her knees, she begins a frantic assault on the zip ties binding her wrists, but the polymer resists. 10 feet. Feels. A guttural sound of pure frustration escapes her as she saws with greater intensity, the steel scoring her own skin. A sudden snap follows. She is liberated, but she does not rise. Instead, she lunges toward Julian. Feels, ignoring her own shackles to attack the thick rope anchoring the hoist to a wall cleat. The fibers part. Feels. The chain immediately goes slack. Julian falls 3 feet, his body instinctively absorbing the impact in a predator's crouch. Though his wrists remain bound, he is no longer a suspended symbol of defeat. Feels. He is now a combatant armed with 6 feet of tempered steel. The first guard closes the distance. Julian unleashes a spinning arc, the chain a metallic whisper that ends with a sickening crunch of bone against a human face. Feels. The man is thrown backward, inert as a puppet with its strings cut. A roar tears from Julian's lungs, a sound devoid of humanity, composed only of agony and liberated rage. He is fueled now by nothing but a cold fire, his injuries rendered irrelevant. Feels. The second guard raises his rifle. From the ground, Elena snatches the fallen cane, launching it like a desperate, perfectly aimed javelin. Feels. The strike against the guard's shins was not designed to incapacitate, merely to disrupt. It created a moment of imbalance. This was the only opening Julian required. He surged into the space, the chain finding its new home around the man's neck. Feels, exerting a final, decisive pressure. A dreadful silence descends, broken only by the labored breathing of the living and the faint whimpers of the dying. Elias, radiating a palpable terror, scrambles toward the exit. The chain sings a low, feels. Predatory tune as Julian closes the gap, his boot pinning his uncle's hand to the floor. The code. Julian's voice is an echo from a tomb. You want the code, Julian, please? We're family. The phrase is repeated, stripped of all meaning. Feels. The code is loyalty is the only currency. Feels. His focus held on Julian for a moment before shifting to Elena. An unspoken command was issued. Find the keys. Free me. He observes the tremor in her hands, a digital glitch in her ingrained subservience as she complies. Feels. Retrieving the key from Elias's pocket to release Julian, the heavy steel cuffs fall to the concrete with a clang. Unfettered, Julian sways, trusting her to support his entire weight. We have to leave. The words are a dry rasp, feels, and a feverish heat emanates from his skin. 5 minutes before reinforcements, they abandon Elias on the cold floor, a specter, a loose thread for the syndicate to snip, and disappear into the fog-draped shipping yard. A steel maze, feels. Elena assumes the lead, her vision piercing the gloom. 2 patrols, she whispers, guiding Julian behind a stack of containers. We require a distraction. Her gaze settles on a forklift nearby, its tines holding a pallet of oil drums. Feels. She raises the weapon she acquired. Her target is not a person, but the vulnerable hydraulic line. A single shot is all it takes. The hose ruptures, the forks collapse, peels, and the steel drums plummet to the concrete with a percussive force that mimics an explosion. While the guards converge on the noses, Elena pulls Julian forward. Now, they sprint across the exposed asphalt toward Terminal 4. Peels. Julian's fingers dance over the keypad, entering a sequence that prompts the heavy door to retract. The area inside is not a warehouse. It is the hidden nucleus of the entire operation, a high-technology command center concealed within a hangar, Peels, alive with the hum of servers and racks of weaponry, and at its center sits a black helicopter. Julian collapses into the chair at the main console, his fingers becoming a blur across the keyboard. Peels. Activating Protocol Zero, he announces, his tone grim. Elias believes he is seizing the throne. What I have done is burn the entire kingdom to the ground. The Thorn Syndicate's financial arteries are severed, Peels, its assets hemorrhaging into 1,000 untraceable charities and shell corporations. Elias is now the ruler of an empire of ash. Outside, tires screech on pavement. A jeep plows through the hangar door, spraying them with shrapnel, Peels. Mercenaries swarm in, cornering them in the glass-walled server room. Julian slides a small velvet box over the console. Take this, he insists, pushing it to her. It is a microdrive, my private offshore holdings. He gestures toward the back, Peels. Diving equipment is near the rear exit. Go. Stop trying to orchestrate my survival. Elena's voice is raw with defiance as she rips an assault rifle from its mount. Peels. We exit this place together, or we die here together. I am finished with men choosing my escape routes for me. Julian simply looks at her streaked with gore, fear making her hands tremble, yet her spine forged from iron. Peels. The Waitress construct had vanished. An operator stood in her place. All right, he exhales. He inputs one final command. The automated defense systems awaken. Ceiling panels retract and turrets descend, Peels, unleashing a barrage of rubber bullets and tear gas upon their assailants. Through the ensuing pandemonium, Julian indicates a heavy-duty truck. The Rhino, get in. Elena takes the driver's seat, turning the ignition. The V8 engine erupts, Peels. She smashes the vehicle through the corrugated metal of the back wall, landing with a jolt on the loading dock. The truck skids on the wet surface as she accelerates toward the main gate. Peels. It's locked, she shouts. Then go through it. Her jaw sets as she floors the accelerator. The reinforced truck annihilates the chain link and steel barricade as if it were paper bursting out onto the public road. Peels. Elena pilots the vehicle with a desperate, sharp focus, navigating the astonished traffic before swerving onto a remote forest road miles outside the city. The sounds of any chase recede into nothing. Julian allows his head to rest against the seat, Peels, his exhaustion a physical weight. We made it, he breathes. He reaches over, his hand covering hers on the steering wheel, sensing the slight tremor. But I have nothing left, Elena. No assets, no organization, Peels. Elena glances down at their connected hands. I'll be expecting a raise, and better benefits. The faintest smile touches Julian's lips as his eyes close. Agreed. Elena watches the dawn begin to illuminate the mountains. Peels. She puts the truck back in gear. She knew of a place. A cabin completely off-grid where they could simply vanish. The Waitress was a role she had played. The survivor was now arriving. The cabin was precisely as she recollected. Peels, a forgotten shelter deep within the Olympic Peninsula, imbued with the scent of pine and damp soil. Moving Julian inside was an ordeal, but for the following 3 days the outside world dissolved. All that remained was the rhythm of the rain, Peels, the heat from the stove and the delirious man on the cot. Elena adopted the role of medic, relying on expired aspirin and strips of her old apron for bandages. Sleep was a resource she could not spare. She maintained a vigil by the window, Peels, a Sig Sauer resting on her lap. On the 4th morning, the fever receded. Peels. Elena was warming a can of beans when a region fractured came from the bedroom. Smells like a bonfire. She was at the threshold in a heartbeat. Julian was sitting upright. He was drawn and pale, but his eyes were lucid. Peels. The amber fire within them had returned. You stayed, he said, his eyes mapping the exhaustion etched beneath her own. I'm persistent, Elena replied, the word a defense against the wave of her own relief. And I'm guarding my investment, Peels. You still owe me a pay increase. A dry chuckle escapes him. Sit down, Elena. He recounted everything. In his fevered absence, the board had been reset. Protocol Zero was successful, he confirms. I verified it on a burner phone, Peels. The Thorn Syndicate is fractured. Elias's wealth was vaporized, scattered across 1,000 different foundations. Peels. The feds raided his estate yesterday. His reign is over, so it's finished. We prevailed. Julian affirms with a nod. But the empire is also gone. I am, for all intents and purposes, dead, Elena. I command no army. I control no city. Feels. All I have is a microdrive with enough for a new beginning, but not enough for dominion. He reaches for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. I have nothing left to offer you except myself. I have no desire for a city, Elena states. Feels. Her tone unyielding. My entire life has been spent in service to men who believed they owned pieces of the world. I do not want an emperor, Julian. I want an equal. She tightens her grip on his hand. You once said loyalty is the only true currency, Feels. I am wealthy with it. Julian draws her nearer, his gaze intense. Elena, I would burn the world down again for this precise moment in this humble cabin with you. Feels. The kiss that followed was not an act of possession, but the desperate intake of air from a man who had been drowning. It carried the taste of wood smoke and of sheer survival. For the first time, Elena was not in service to anyone. Feels. She was precisely where she had elected to be. 6 months later, the sun of the Amalfi Coast casts a golden light upon the stone terrace of Il's Refugio. The establishment is a hushed secret among Italy's elite, discreet, private, flawless. Feels. Elena navigates the tables in a simple white dress, adjusting a floral arrangement on table 3. There is no apron. She proceeds directly to the back office. Julian sits at a desk made of olive wood, analyzing a digital ledger. He appears healthy, Feels, his tan hiding the faint trace of a scar on his shoulder. Feels. The Marseille delivery is behind schedule, he remarks without looking up. No, it is not. Elena corrects him from the doorway. I rerouted it through a private marina in Capri. The port inspector in Naples was becoming excessively avaricious. Feels. Julian raises his head at that, a slow grin spreading over his features. You possess a frightening aptitude for illicit logistics, my dear. It is merely logistics, she smiles. Feels. It is no different from seating a party of 12 that arrives without a reservation. One simply rearranges the components until they fit. Julian rises, wrapping his arms around her waist. The Minister of Finance arrives tonight. Feels. He wishes to discuss import duties. I will manage him, Elena says. I have experience with men who believe themselves to be important. I am well aware, model. Feels. Julian pressed his lips to her temple. Are you happy, Elena? It's a life of stillness compared to the steakhouse. It's not so still, she murmured, her focus on the deep azure of the Tyrrhenian Sea. They had safety, they had means, they had freedom. Wait, Feels. Julian said, pulling a small framed item from a drawer. It was a creased receipt, forever marked by a single darkened drop of blood. Gunman behind you. Deal gone wrong. Exit now. He set it on the desk. I had it framed. Feels. A reminder that the greatest deal of my life cost $68 and a generous tip. Elena's smile warmed the entire room. She took a pen and began to write on the glass. Feels. She circled the word exit, then drew a sharp arrow that pointed right at Julian. She added one more word. Never. After kissing him, she turned back toward the terrace door. Back to it, boss. Yes, ma'am. Feels. The man who once ruled the city's underworld replied. Elena stepped outside, breathing in the smell of lemon trees carried on the sea breeze. She was done being a survivor now, she wrote the menu. This chapter on Elena and Julian is concluded, Feels. It began with a singular choice, a waitress catching a detail everyone else overlooked, and it ended in a partnership that toppled a criminal dynasty. It remains a clinical footnote that the most lethal weapon is rarely a gun. It's perception, Feels. The capacity to see the world not for what it pretends to be, but for what it is, Feels. She could have just watched. A ghost in the machine, content to let the gears of murder grind to their conclusion and then fade back into the quiet shelter of her own life. But she chose differently. The pen found its way to her hand, Feels. The ink bled onto the page, a deliberate circle that was less an act of saving another and more an act of violent creation for herself. Now put yourself inside the crushing silence of that choice. Weighed down by that same impossible moment, Feels. What would you have done? Would you have passed on the warning, knowing your own shadow could become the man sent to kill you? Or would you have picked the simple comfort of staying alive? Leave your own script in the comments, Feels. I am keen to see the scene you would build. If this dissection of toxic loyalty and the birth of a criminal enterprise resonated with you, and if you wish for more studies of simple lives twisted into terrible new forms, signal your approval, Feels. It guarantees these narratives are not lost to the void. Subscribe and ring the bell. Be here when the next file is open.